It started like any other Friday night. I had just wrapped up a long week at work and needed to unwind. There's a bar a few blocks from my apartment, a dive called the Rusty Lantern. It's the kind of place where the bartender knows your name. The jukebox is stuck in the 80s, and the smell of spilled beer and old wood hangs in the air like a permanent resident. That night, the place was unusually empty. Just me, the bartender, and a few regulars scattered across the dimly lit room. I found my usual spot at the far end of the bar, ordered a whiskey neat, and let the amber liquid burn away the week's stress. It was halfway through my second drink when he walked in. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, dark, sunken, and unblinking, swept the room before settling on me. Something about him made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off. Weirdos weren't exactly uncommon at the Rusty Lantern. He took the stool next to mine, even though the bar was practically empty. Without a word, he gestured to the bartender, who slid him a glass of something dark. I tried not to stare, but his presence was magnetic in the worst way, like staring at a car crash. Finally, he turned to me and smiled. His teeth were too white, too perfect, and his lips seemed to stretch too far across his face. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Something like that," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "You come here often?" I nodded, not really in the mood for small talk. But he didn't seem to care. He started talking about the bar, the city, the weather, mundane stuff. I answered in monosyllables, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "You're not as alone as you think you are." I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. "What?" He tilted his head, his smile never wavering. "You've felt it, haven't you? That creeping sensation when you're walking home late at night, like someone's watching you." My mouth went dry. I forced a laugh. "I think you've had one too many, buddy." "Maybe," he said, his tone light. But his eyes were deadly serious. "Or maybe I'm just more aware than most." I downed the rest of my whiskey, suddenly eager to leave. But as I stood up, his hand shot out and gripped my arm. His touch was ice cold. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his smile widening. "Let go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He released me, but his eyes followed me as I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. Just before I stepped outside, I glanced back. He was still watching me, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. The walk home felt longer than usual. The streets were eerily quiet, and every shadow seemed to pulse with hidden life. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, but every time I turned around, the street was empty. By the time I reached my building, my heart was pounding, and my hands were slick with sweat. I double-locked my door and turned on every light in my apartment. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just a creepy guy at a bar. But as the hours dragged on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I couldn't relax. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I turned off the lights, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers up to my chin. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, and then I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the living room. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or the building settling. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone, or something, was in my apartment. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and crept toward the living room, every step feeling like an eternity. The scratching stopped as I reached the doorway. The room was empty, but the front door was wide open. The locks were mangled as if they'd been clawed apart. My heart was racing. I stepped forward, my grip tightening on the bat. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows near the window. It was tall and thin, just like the man from the bar, but its face was all wrong. The features were stretched and distorted, like a grotesque mask of human skin. It smiled at me, its teeth gleaming in the darkness. "I told you," it said, its voice a low growl. "You're not as alone as you think you are." I don't remember much after that. I swung the bat, screaming, but it moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor, my head pounding and my vision blurry. The figure was gone, and the front door was swinging shut. I called the police, but they didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. They said it was probably a break-in, that I must have scared the intruder off. But I know what I saw. And every time I close my eyes, I see that smile. I haven't been back to the Rusty Lantern since. I don't go out at night anymore, and I've installed more locks than I can count. But no matter what I do, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. And one day, he'll come back. It started like any other Friday night. After a grueling week at work, I headed to my usual bar downtown. It was a hole-in-the-wall joint, the kind of place where the beer is cheap and the bartender knows your name. I liked it because it was unpretentious, a safe haven from the chaos of the city. But that night it felt different from the moment I walked in. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. The lighting seemed dimmer than usual, casting long shadows on the walls. A strange tension hung in the room, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. I brushed it off, thinking I was just overly tired. The bartender, Joe, greeted me with a nod and slid my usual drink across the counter. "Busy week?" he asked, his voice unusually low. I nodded and took a sip. The first thing I noticed was the taste. It was off, metallic, like the glass hadn't been rinsed properly. I wrinkled my nose but didn't say anything. Joe had never served me a bad drink before, and I didn't want to make a fuss. As the night went on, I started noticing the other patrons. They weren't the usual crowd. Most of them were unfamiliar, their faces pale and drawn, eyes darting around like they were afraid of being watched. A man in a corner booth kept glancing at the door, his hands trembling as he nursed his whiskey. A woman at the bar sat rigidly, her fingers tapping in erratic rhythm on the counter. It felt like I had walked into a gathering of ghosts. Then there was the guy sitting 2 stools down from me. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He wore a tattered coat despite the warm weather, and his hands were wrapped in dirty bandages. He hadn't ordered anything, just sat there staring at the mirror behind the bar. Occasionally his lips would move like he was talking to someone, but no sound came out. Joe seemed uneasy too. He kept glancing at the clock, wiping down the same section of the counter over and over. When I asked him if everything was all right, he just shrugged and muttered something about a weird crowd tonight. Around midnight, the atmosphere took a darker turn. The lights flickered, and the faint hum of the bar's old jukebox cut out, plunging the room into an eerie silence. The man in the corner booth stood up abruptly, knocking over his glass. "It's here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's here." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What's here?" I asked, my voice sounding small and hollow. He didn't answer, just bolted for the door. As he passed me, I caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were wide with terror, and his skin was clammy and pale. The woman at the bar followed suit, grabbing her purse and stumbling out without a word. One by one, the other patrons left, until it was just me, Joe, and the strange man in the tattered coat. Joe locked the door and turned to me, his face grim. "You should leave," he said. "What's going on?" I demanded. "What's everyone so scared of?" Before he could answer, the man in the tattered coat let out a low, guttural laugh. It was a sound that didn't seem human, more like the growl of some feral animal. He turned to me, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You stayed," he said, his voice raspy and cold. "Brave or foolish?" I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Who are you?" He smiled, revealing jagged yellowed teeth. "A messenger," he said, "and your time is up." Before I could react, the room seemed to warp around me. The walls pulsed like they were alive, and the air grew thick and suffocating. Shadows began to move, detaching themselves from their sources and slithering across the floor like living creatures. The man's form started to change, his limbs elongating, his skin turning a sickly gray. His eyes burned brighter, and his smile stretched unnaturally wide. I stumbled back, knocking over my stool. Joe grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back door. "We have to go," he said urgently. "Now." We burst into the alley, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I turned to Joe, my mind racing. "What the hell was that?" Joe shook his head, his face pale. "I've seen him before," he said. "He comes every few years, always around this time. People who stay, they don't come back." I wanted to ask more, but a loud crash from inside the bar cut me off. The windows shattered outward, and a guttural roar echoed into the night. Joe grabbed my arm again and started running, pulling me along the darkened alley. We didn't stop until we were several blocks away, gasping for breath under the flickering light of a street lamp. That was the last time I went to that bar. I don't know what I saw that night, and part of me doesn't want to know. All I know is that something dark and ancient walks among us, and it's best to leave when it shows up. It started like any other Friday night. After a long week at work, I decided to grab a drink at a small bar just outside of downtown. The kind of place where the lighting is dim, the music is a low hum, and the bartender knows your name if you've been there more than twice. I'd been there plenty of times before, but that night, it felt different. Like the air was heavier somehow. The bartender, Marco, gave me a nod when I walked in. He slid my usual whiskey sour across the counter before I even sat down. I liked Marco. He was sharp, but not the type to pry into your business. That night, though, his usual easygoing demeanor seemed strained. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and he kept glancing over his shoulder toward the far corner of the room. I followed his gaze. There was a man sitting alone at a corner table. He was nondescript, a little older, graying hair, dressed in a faded jacket that looked 2 sizes too big. What stood out, though, was how still he was. He wasn't sipping his drink or checking his phone like everyone else. He just sat there, staring at the table in front of him, his hands folded neatly as if he were waiting for something. Or someone. "Who's that?" I asked Marco, leaning in so he could hear me over the music. Marco's hand hesitated over the glass he was drying. "Don't know. Came in about an hour ago. Hasn't ordered anything. Just sitting there." I shrugged it off. People were weird sometimes. Maybe he was waiting for a friend, or maybe he'd had a rough day and just needed a place to sit. I went back to my drink, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I'd glance back at the man in the corner, but he didn't move, not an inch. The night wore on, and the bar filled up. A group of rowdy college kids claimed the pool table, a couple argued in hushed tones at a booth, and a guy with a guitar tried to coax tips from the crowd near the jukebox. It was business as usual, except for the man in the corner. No one seemed to notice him, but I couldn't stop. Around midnight, the bar began to thin out. I'd had a few drinks by then, enough to dull the edge of whatever unease I'd felt earlier. Marco came over to refill my glass, and I leaned in again. "He still hasn't moved," I said, nodding toward the corner. Marco glanced over, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of fear cross his face. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's weird. I've been doing this job for 10 years, seen all kinds of people, but that guy, something about him, man, gives me the creeps." We both looked at the man again. This time he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head and turned to look at us. His eyes, they were wrong. Too dark, too deep, like staring into a void. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. Marco's hand gripped the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles turned white. The man stood up. It wasn't a natural motion. It was too fluid, like a puppet being pulled upright by invisible strings. He started walking toward us, and with every step, the noise in the bar seemed to fade. By the time he reached the counter, it was dead silent. "Evening," he said. His voice was low, raspy, like dry leaves scraping across pavement. I managed to nod, but Marco didn't say a word. The man placed his hands on the counter, and up close I noticed something else. His fingernails were blackened, cracked, as if they'd been burned. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Maybe you can help me." Sure," I stammered. "Who are you looking for?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned in closer, so close I could smell the faint scent of smoke and earth on him. "Someone who doesn't belong," he said finally. "Someone who's hiding." The words sent a chill down my spine. "I don't know what you mean," I said. My voice sounded too high, too thin. The man's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You'd know if you saw them," he said. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the bar. As soon as the door closed behind him, the noise came rushing back. The music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses. It was like nothing had happened, but Marco and I just stared at each other, both of us pale and shaken. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Marco shook his head. "I don't know," he said, "but I'm closing early tonight." I finished my drink and left not long after. As I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man in the faded jacket, but the parking lot was empty. That night I dreamt of him. His dark eyes, his cracked nails, his strange, unnatural movements. In the dream, he was standing at the foot of my bed, staring down at me with that cold, empty smile. When I woke up, my throat was dry, and the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air. I never went back to that bar. And to this day, I can't help but wonder, was he looking for me?